Here's the thing. So you talk about these tariffs and things going on. If you talk to a supply chain professional, they'll say, well, it's just another Tuesday, to be honest. So there's stuff happening, right? And so, but look at what we did the last 5 years, right? We shifted from West Coast to East Coast arrivals for a period of a couple months. Things shut down and, we absorbed. And I think some of those muscles that we trained are still here. Supply chains thrive on being able to handle these things. I'd like to think of them as shock absorbers. So the supply chain is able to be the shock absorber, right, of all these disruptions to keep the business operating smoothly.
You spent weeks planning your transportation procurement strategy, but one rejected tender throws it all off. For paper manufacturers, the execution phase is where the money's made or lost. Chris Caplice from DAT is here to talk about why your routing guide may be costing you thousands and what dynamic tendering can do to fix it. So welcome into another episode of Everything is Logistics, a podcast for the thinkers in freight. I am your host, Blythe Milligan, and we are proudly presented by SPI Logistics. And for this episode, we are presented by DAT as well. So Chris, I've been listening to a bunch of your podcasts, getting, prepped for this call. And so I'm super excited to have this conversation with you. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Blythe. I'm glad to be here. I'm sorry you had to listen to some of my podcasts. I'm not nearly as professional as you. So,
well, thank you so much. That is very kind of you to say.
That.
No, it wasn't. It was actually very, not actually, but it was very insightful, especially one of the episodes that I was listening to that the host, I think the conversation came from a show from Easy Post. And she said that you were the most popular episode of 2024. And that's why she invited you back for 2025. So
that was a fun conversation. They're good people.
Absolutely. Now, for folks who may not be familiar with your work, can you explain a little bit of your background and your roles of what you do for DAT and also MIT?
Yeah, sure. So I was actually a civil engineer in undergrad and went in the Army, came out, got a master's in transportation, and decided I didn't want to work for the government building roads. So I came and got a PhD up here at MIT and focused in on the use of roads, mainly truck transportation. Spent about 8 years in software development, developing tools to help shippers procure transportation. And that kind of naturally morphed into working with then Chainalytics that became and was acquired by DAT almost 5 years ago, pretty much to the month, right in the pandemic. A great time to be acquired, right as a pandemic kicks off. And so what I do at DAT is I'm working on the shipper side, because just if some of your listeners don't know about DAT, it's the largest freight analytics company out there. We work with shippers, carriers, brokers, and we're the main source of information on pricing and other data, capacity data, load to truck ratio, to help all the players, all three stakeholders in the industry do a better job, making the market more efficient and more effective. So they brought Chainalytics in, which is a part that I was worked with, and to kind of finish off the trifecta, so working on the shipper side. In addition to that, I've been up at MIT for a little over 20 years running part of the Center for Transportation and Logistics. We work with companies, do research, and we have educational programs. I created something called FreightLab up here, which looks at pretty much the same thing I do with DAT. How can shippers, carriers, and brokers work together better? And so the stuff I do academically with MIT and the stuff I do in practice with DAT really merge. The Venn diagram is pretty full there, but that's kind of how my path to the freight transportation market.
And I think you just celebrated 50 years, a 50-year anniversary for the Center for Transportation and Logistics. Is that correct?
Yes. So CTL started, it's 52 years now, I think.
Oh, wow.
It started when everything was regulated. So the deregulation, the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, the Staggers Act, all those things. Well, before that happened, people didn't know what would happen. And so there was a lot of analysis and studying going on to say, okay, what's going to happen when we deregulate? And, so that's really the kernel of where it started. But since then, we've grown. We have about 150 researchers, staff here, about 80 to 100 students a year. We work with over 50 to 100 companies a year. We really try to come up with innovation and drive them into practice. That's kind of what we do up here.
And do you find that, especially with, since 2020, you kind of brought it up that
Mhm.
supply chain kind of took center stage, at least in the media aspect, is what kind of it felt like to me. Has that sort of been seen in student interactions or student enrollment with your role?
I think the biggest thing is that we don't have to explain what supply chain is at Thanksgiving anymore to relatives because everyone knows what it is. It's the thing that stopped me from getting X during the pandemic. But the thing that people don't realize, or they don't think about it as much, the supply chains never stopped. No one starved. Stuff came in, toilet paper. The main problem there, people were hoarding, but stuff kept coming. The supply chains never shut down. I think people have awareness of that and appreciation of that, especially post pandemic. We're seeing that there was a huge surge of people coming into the industry, and I think that's still happening. When I was going into college in the '80s, it didn't exist. The phrase didn't exist. There was logistics wasn't even really much of a practice. So it's really changed since then. Most people my age came into the industry different ways, but now we're seeing more people coming in. They do a supply chain undergrad or logistics undergrad, and then they continue on. So that is changing. But I think the awareness of what supply chains are has definitely increased post pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely get a lot of those questions around the holidays of what's going on at the ports. And I'm like, I don't
Yeah,
even know what a port is. My
yeah,
grandmother's friends are, talking to me about this. And so
yeah.
I definitely echo that experience where, I used to have to explain it. Now they kind of understand it a little bit more, but not, there's still some education on my end that I have to do, at least when it
Right.
comes to family.
And you're
Now,
personally responsible now for the supply chain breaking because it's kind of like oxygen. You don't notice it until it's gone. And
right.
that's what people have recognized. So supply chain was a big issue when it was hard to get stuff. Now, when it works smoothly, you should be invisible, right? And that's where we kind of are now in this stage of the market.
Yes, exactly. And you recently penned an article, moving into sort of I guess the paper manufacturer focus for this conversation because I really want to get a ground level of what is currently being experienced by these manufacturers, and then how they're addressing sort of global supply chain issues, geopolitical issues, obviously the T word tariffs, which we've been learning about ad nauseum over the last couple of months. But when you recently penned an article talking about when tendering loads, don't go chasing waterfalls, which I now have that song stuck in my head. It's been stuck in my head all day. But you open the article with transportation procurement has two phases or moments of truth. A strategic phase where shippers develop a long term plan and select a group of carriers to handle the freight for that period, and an execution phase where loads are actually tendered. Walk me through that first phase of what you're talking about. What are sort of the
Yeah.
table stakes for today?
Yes. I stole that phrase from AJ Lafley, the former CEO of P&G, the two moments of truth. When he talked about it, the two moments of truth for a CPG company is on the aisle, someone grabbing it, and the second is it good when you use it? The two moments for transportation, as opposed to most other commodities or other services or products that are bought. There's also two moments. There's a moment where an RFP, an annual bid, is done, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that just is the promise of volume and capacity if it materializes. The second moment of truth is when an actual load materializes. You have to assign it to a carrier. So two moments of truth. And historically, since probably mid 1990s, once deregulation kind of sank in, the first moment of truth was done by an annual request for proposal or bid. Some companies don't like the word bid, but it really is. It's where the shipper says, okay, here's what I expect the volume to be on every one of my lanes, which could be 5 to 20,000 lanes, 5 to 5-digit zips. And they give it to the carriers, and the carriers come back with a rate on the lanes they're interested in. The shipper does some advanced optimization, finding the best mix or assignment or allocation of carriers to lanes. This is what I did my dissertation on back in the mid 90s. And then they assign it out to the carriers, and that feeds into what's known as a routing guide. And there's been a ton of work in optimization, in operations research, and different techniques to come up with the perfect plan,
Hmm.
right? To come up with the ideal plan, use scenarios. You can favor incumbency. You can restrict it so that your minority carriers get a certain amount of the business. Your carrier base isn't so big. So it's very customizable, and you can have thousands of scenarios that you run. But at the end of the day, all you're doing is creating the plan if the volume actually materializes. So that's the first moment of truth.
And then the second moment of truth is that actual execution phase. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first phase ends essentially when the winners of the auction, right, on each lane are fed into the routing guide. And the routing guide sits within the transportation management system, or a TMS. And what it's there, it's just a catalog, right? So when a load comes in, it's going from Chicago to Des Moines. It goes in and says, okay, which carriers has Chicago to Des Moines? And it goes straight through. And if it's a good TMS, it'll tender automatically to that primary carrier. And if the weird thing about truckload, because I'm mainly talking truckload transportation here, is that the contracts that were set up in that annual RFP, they're binding in price, right? If the carrier hauls the load, they have to honor the price that they committed to in the bid. However, the shipper is not committing that the volume will ever materialize. Even if they said, 5 a week, they're not guaranteeing that. And the carrier is not guaranteeing that they will 100% accept every load, just because of the dynamic nature. They might not have a truck in that area. They might, for some other reason. It might be that the shipper is giving more than they said they would to the carrier, and they just don't have the capacity. So you've got this loose contract. And so the load comes in, goes through the routing guide, gets assigned to the primary carrier. They reject. If they take it, that's fine. That's great. And it goes. And that can be, depending on the market, 70% of the loads get accepted by the primary, 80% even. If they reject it, then it goes through what's called a routing guide waterfall. And the waterfall is simply made up of the carriers who bid in the RFP who didn't win, right? And so their rates are going to be higher than the winning rate. And so you go to the first alternate and offer it to them. And if they take it, great. If not, go to the third, the fourth, the fifth. That's the traditional way that a routing guide works. So that second moment of the truth is actually finding a carrier to match to that load right now, not the plan of future business that's done in the first moment of truth. Does that make sense?
It does, and you actually helped me understand that aspect, because I come from an asset-based 3PL, but I was just an executive assistant, and so I never actually booked the freight myself. So that is hell. I've heard these phrases for years, but now to fully kind of grasp of that entire process, I appreciate that breakdown. That's the MIT education, I think, coming out of you. Now, I would imagine that you don't want the majority of your shipments to reach that. Don't go chasing waterfalls.
No.
To go back to the article title, what are some of, I guess, with everything that's going on in the world, geopolitical tensions and tariffs and all, I would imagine that for a lot of these shipments, are they falling within that 80%, or are they falling
Yeah,
within that 20%?
it's a good question. And so, so the two moments of truth, right? The RFP and then the tender. The RFPs are a pain. No one likes them, right? And so they take a lot of work from the shipper. The carrier's never given enough time. The data no one believes, because you're asking the shipper to forecast for 52 weeks volume on each lane. It's ridiculous. However, it tends to work. So it's hard to change something that tends to work. 90% of most truckload moves go under contract. So it kind of works until it doesn't. And so what typically happened, that waterfall used to work pretty well. And the reason why we did it that way, and most TMSs developed in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, it was simple, right? And so all the expertise, all the sophistication was in the strategic planning, that RFP process I talked about, that does the perfect assignment. The execution systems were pretty stupid, right? They just said, here, match this. It was all about execution speed. Well, now technology has changed. You can be a little smarter down there. And so you can have a lot more sophistication in real-time execution, which is a relatively new capability. So the waterfall method was a great way. It worked most of the times until it didn't. And during the pandemic, it really failed. And it failed for two reasons. One is it takes long. It takes too long to do it. Every time you go to the next one, you got to give them time to respond or not. And so you can eat up a day, 2 days, 3 days. So it gets very stale and your lead time keeps shrinking. The second thing is they found after the second or third, especially during the pandemic, why bother deeper? No one's going to take it. No one's going to take it. So you need to go out to what's known as the spot market. And the spot market, as opposed to a contract market with RFPs, it's a rate for this lane, this load on this lane at this time with all the details. When I do an RFP, you have a projection of potential future business. For spot market, it's right now. And so it used to be using the spot market, spot was a 4-letter word to most shippers. You wanted to stay in the contract because you want rate visibility and stability and all of that. And so because of routing guide, the waterfall method took so long and it really wasn't working that well. That's when I meant chasing waterfalls. And I had to name it that because of the song. I mean, come on.
Which
It's
I'm still
catchy.
seeing in the back of my head right now. Now there was another article you penned as well, and the title was "The RFP is dead. Long live the RFP." And that kind of
Yes.
sounds like how we're trying to balance that fine line of the RFP. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's a pain. Anyone who's been involved with it takes, some shippers will take up to 6 months to get their data set and everything, give it to the carriers. Carriers get a week to respond back, and then they spend 2 to 3 months analyzing, running all these scenarios. So it could be that the rates were submitted and they don't get enacted for 6 months. So it's so hard to do this, but it works. It tends to work. 90% of all shipments, truckload, generally go by contract as opposed to a dynamic price.
Mm.
But one of the things that's come up from this that's really kind of interesting is that, using contracts, it's kind of a one size fits all where you set the contract for every rate. And when I was running bids back in the 90s and early 2000s, we'd work with shippers and they might have one load on a lane last year. And most shippers will take what happened last year, project that to next year and modify it slightly, as they need to. But they would keep every lane that had any volume and bid it out, and they would round it up to one a week, right? Because you'd show average weekly volume. And so what would happen is you'd have tremendous number of lanes that get bid out. And unfortunately, a majority of the lanes, not the volume, gets ghosted, which means the shipper creates it, puts it out to bid, carrier analyzes, bids on it, shipper assigns it to them, and then over the course of a year, nothing happens. No volume goes on it. It's called ghosting. And so we've been analyzing this with a bunch of different shippers, and it can be up to 50-60% of the lanes in an RFP. And so as you look deeper, and when you look at the network of a shipper, especially a paper manufacturer, anyone who has heavy transportation costs as a percentage of total costs, they tend to be very dispersed. And so Pareto, the 80-20 rule, really works. And so 80% of the volume is usually on just 15% of the lanes. The other 20% of the volume is on the 75 or 85% of the lanes. So you have high volume lanes, and then you have a long tail. And the thing that we've come up with, or suddenly the realization is, you don't need a contract for everything. So those ones that are really long tail, onesie twosies, really not consistent freight, then treat those differently. And that's one of the things I brought up in the waterfalls argument, because most of the lanes that fail, like I described, and have to go down the waterfall, you can identify ahead of time. They're the low volume lanes, and you only do it 3 times a year. And so it's going to fail. So why even go through the process of bidding and just treat it dynamically? So you want to set up some kind of other mechanism to assign a carrier to that. You might not know the price right away, but to be honest, it was going to go to the spot market anyway because it was going to fail the routing guide.
And so for a lot of these, sort of low volume lanes of what you're talking about, I'm curious, is this sort of a new data point that you guys are analyzing and looking at over the last, say, you've been at, MIT, I think for, 20 years, you just said. How has that data collection evolved? Is this a sort of a new data point for you guys to monitor? I'm curious if there's other data points that maybe have, come up or popped up onto the scene within the last handful of years.
Yeah, I think everyone's kind of recognized that, there are high volume and low volume lanes. I don't think people looked as much as the impact, because there's a strategy in procurement, which is you get a contract for everything, right? Because then it's like, Linus's safety blanket. You've got the blanket there. I've got a contract on that lane. So it provides false certainty. And it's there. But if you're a CFO or a chief purchasing officer, that's good. You have a contract and everything, because the last thing you want to do is have spot rates, because then how do you budget for that? So there's been a fear or reluctance to allow dynamic kind of planning there. People try to put certainty on it as much as possible. The problem is it doesn't work. It isn't effective for that. And so there's been more of an acceptance to use spot as a strategy, not for everything, but for a certain segment, and thinking of procurement more on a portfolio where you've got like dedicated lanes with a private fleet where it's high volume, consistent, and balanced, right? You can have out and back and things like that. Then you have contract lanes, which are relatively high volume, and we can talk about what that means. And then you have the lanes that are very sporadic, inconsistent, and those should be treated differently, and you should do those dynamically. But one of the points is people look at volume, but in our analysis, it's actually different. It's consistency matters more than volume. And let me give you a simple example. Everyone has a lane where you might have 100 loads per year, but if it happens in a 2-week period, that's not a consistent lane, right? You want to have a little bit of volume every week, every month. So what we found is you'd think those would be correlated, but in our analysis, they're only about a 53 to 55% correlation. So just using volume by itself isn't really a good proxy because you get some of these wacky lanes, especially if you're in ag, where it'll just during the season, your volume, it just goes through the roof and then it goes away. So looking at consistency, which is the number of weeks per year that lane has volume, is a real good proxy for whether you should do a contract on it or whether you should let it go to dynamic freight.
Now, zeroing in on sort of the paper manufacturers for a
Okay.
moment. Now, there's a lot of talk, especially in the news, around, obviously manufacturing, bringing manufacturing back. I'm curious what the overall landscape looks like for paper manufacturers. I understand a lot of them are located in the Southeast. I'm based in Jacksonville, Florida. We were kind of known for, a few decades about don't go to that town because it stinks because we had a bunch of
Yeah.
paper mills around. Some of those have shut down, especially in the downtown area, but still the Southeast is very, paper manufacturer heavy. I'm curious, is that sort of I guess a victim of offshoring or nearshoring, or is it primarily staying in the United States for paper manufacturers?
Paper manufacturing is predominantly domestic, where we had a lot of exports of waste paper. And that's probably, I honestly don't know how it's being affected right now with the tariffs. I know so for a while there, China was refusing.
Hmm.
But most of the domestic, because it's such a heavy product, it's being produced domestically. The reason why a lot of mills have gone down is there's been consolidation of the paper packaging industry. They were way overcapacitated for the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. My brother used to work in the industry, and you've just seen a lot of consolidation, more efficient and effective use of their mills. But the thing that makes paper and packaging so interesting is that it's such a heavy product and it's relatively low value, right? You're not going to ship $1 million worth of product in a trailer. It's something where the cost of the transportation is very high as a percentage of total cost of goods. And whenever that's the case, then you have to pay especially close attention to your transportation. It just makes sense. It's such a big piece of the pie. If I'm shipping, say, iPhones by truck, right, I wouldn't care as much, right? Because the value of an iPhone, I'd be worried about theft at that point, a truck full of iPhones. But for paper, you have to be very cognizant of every penny for transportation. That's why it's very important for them to understand where the market's going, where rates are, and what's the best way to secure capacity for the lanes that they have freight.
And are you seeing those manufacturers sort of lock in those, RFPs early on? Is it this a once a year type, bid process, or is it much more, I'm probably steady freight, I would imagine.
Well, it's changed, right? It used to be pre-pandemic, everyone would generally run an annual bid. And then as things happen, plants close, new customers come online, you run what's known as a mini bid, where it might be, okay, these 20 lanes that are for a new customer, you bid them out and it goes quick. During the pandemic, everything went to hell, right? You have CPG manufacturers suddenly created more manufacturing locations. Retailers were requesting, high OTIF, on time in full, and so they didn't have enough product to send out right away. So if you talk to some of the CPG manufacturers, they were taking product from the line onto a truck, no intermediate RDC or anything. So there was a lot of shipment of partial loads. So you saw a ton of inefficient shipping just to get the product out because you'd have such shifts in demand, and then the production facilities would open, close, and packaging, especially the packaging side of paper and packaging, is really a derived demand, right? Their demand for packaging is contingent on the product being sold. It's not that no one buys packaging just to get packaging. You get it for your product. Like transportation. Transportation is a derived demand. And so you have to see what your demand is going to be, you have to forecast your next customers and your customers' demand, which is very hard. So the paper and packaging have it especially hard because, one, it's such a high percentage of their costs, and two, it's derived. So it's highly volatile on things that they can't control.
And then I know that some folks, they will follow what's called the cardboard index, where if you are if there's a certain amount of sales for cardboard, then things are looking good, then demand is high, and then if it kind of falls off of a cliff, then demand is low, and you can kind of, I guess, judge the economy based on how much cardboard is being shipped out. Have you heard of that index before? I'm sure you have.
I know of it. I don't follow it as much. I think it's something that does good indicator. I know that like purchasing fuel, there is an index for how people will buy product and what their prices will be, because as a commodity, you usually have an index to something. And so in trucking, you have the same thing for fuel, where you peg it to what the DOE, Department of Energy, releases every Monday, and you kind of share your surcharge there, because for any kind of procurement of a commodity, you always want to separate out the things that are controllable and the things that are not. And for trucking, fuel is uncontrollable. No one controls the price of fuel. It moves on macroeconomic factors. For paper and product, pulp is about the same thing. So you look at that pulp index, and that can actually give you a good indicator along those lines.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of the cardboard index, we should be watching the pulp index.
There's different indexes here. I'd have to defer to my brother who knows this industry better, but it's the same concept. It's the same concept. Something that you cannot control, you index, and you try to share the risk or balance the risk between buyer and seller.
And so for a lot of these manufacturers of what you're talking about, I would imagine that they would want to, I would imagine for a majority of manufacturers, they want to keep their freight in a contract system. But are you seeing for paper manufacturers, are you seeing that go more to the spot market, or some of the waterfall carriers, what you mentioned earlier?
I think if people had their druthers, they would go contract for everything if they could. But it really depends on one of the hallmarks of the truckload industry is that it's not stable. Because you have over 200,000 carriers. And I don't think we've talked about this. One of the statistics is that 96% or 94% of the truckload carriers, truckload is point to point, not the LTL guys, the point to point full truckload. 96% have less than 20 trucks. So you say, oh, they're really small. What people don't do is look at the other way. 4% of all the trucks have about 2/3 of all the truck capacity. So the market is, yes, it has a long tail, but it's pretty consolidated at one end. And so because you have such a long tail, and the barrier of entry and exit is very low for truckload. All you need is a CDL, a truck, and a smartphone at this point. So because these carriers can enter and exit at will pretty much, and some of them will enter the market, and then if the market gets soft for them, they'll park it and they'll go work construction, or they'll go fishing, or they'll do something else, but the capacity can come right back in. So because of that, the truckload market, it works in cycles. And we saw the biggest cycle was the pandemic cycle that really took off in Q2 of 2020, and it ended in Q2 of 2022. So 2 years, we had these ridiculously high rates where spot was higher than contract. And that's when every shipper wanted to go to contract, right? Because you didn't want to pay those spot prices. But then since the summer of 2022, it dropped. And it's only now recovering. In December 2024, it finally approached the levels that it was pre-pandemic in the first quarter of 2020. So that's been 3 years it took. So 2 years up in a cycle, 3 years down, crawling back. And since then, what's actually been happening, we've been flat. So when you ask, do shippers prefer contract or spot? The answer is it depends. If the market is tight, which means spot rates are higher than contract, then yes, they want contract. When spot dips below contract, which it has been for the last 3 years, then they'll say, well, maybe spot's not so bad, right? And if you're a heavy, like a paper and product packaging manufacturer, that's a big chunk of change, so you'll tend to use the spot more. And so what you see now is the relationship between the shippers and the carriers. Do you honor the contract? On which side? We did a paper up here, about 4 years ago, and it posed the question: are carriers elephants or goldfish? And so the idea is, and this was pre-pandemic, so it's looking to the last cycle before the pandemic was a tight market, 2017, 2018, and it crashed in 2019, right? And we posed the question: if a shipper treated you poorly during a soft market, how did you treat them during a tight market? Are you an elephant, which you remember those who did and you treat them accordingly, or are you a goldfish who has no memory? Right. And so what are your thoughts? What do you think? Are carriers elephants or goldfish?
Depends on how the money is, I guess.
They are total goldfish, total, because they can't afford not to be. And so we're in the middle of doing this process, the same project, but for the other side. Are shippers elephants or goldfish? My colleague, Dr. Angie Acacella, is working on this, and we'll probably have something over the summer. But our hypothesis is shippers are total elephants. They remember if a carrier screwed them over, in their opinion, or didn't provide capacity, they're not going to get the business in the bid. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And this kind of goes to, what do shippers prefer? Depends where the market is, right? Where I stand depends on where I sit. But we do see in better shippers, right, that it's not like everyone bottom feeds, goes trough to trough. So what you do, if you do an RFP, and let's say you say, I think there's going to be 5 loads a week on this lane. And if there are 5 loads a week, you go contract. But if there's a 6 load, right, you send that to spot. You don't give it back to that contract carrier. So we're seeing better shippers will adhere to that contract. And the same thing happens in a tight market. If you have those 5 loads and a 6 load comes, the carrier won't say, oh, you send that to spot. They will try to capture it as spot, because they will cover what they promised, but above that, they'll treat differently. So I think both sides are starting to do that, but it really depends on the state of the market where it is.
Is that where dynamic tendering kind of comes into play?
I think so. The thought is, if you have your 10,000 lanes and only 500 of them, maybe 1,000 of them, let's say 2,000 of them have volume of more than, say, 1 a week, then those other ones, why bother set up a contract for them if they're going to fail anyway? And instead, you have to set up some kind of mechanism to get capacity in real time. And that's what we call a dynamic tendering. And there's many different ways to do that. One is you could go to a load board, which brokers do more than shippers. But you can also set up a small set of carriers, whether they're asset-based or non-asset. It depends on the mix you want. And you want to be able to give them a shipment, a tender, and have them come back with a price they'll guarantee. And then you solve it that way. So yes, it's dynamic in that the price will change, but you've controlled the market you're going to. You're not going to the entire market because you want to validate the carrier. You go to a set core. And so those set of core carriers also have committed, and they probably have business elsewhere in your network. So these are like your cream of the crop carriers, mainly non-asset. Brokers are really good at this because they can control things a little better. And so you just have to have some kind of mechanism that in real time will assign a carrier to that. And again, it's a closed group of 5, 6, 7 carriers, but the price will be dependent on the situation at that time. Other shippers will use the DAT rate, which we can develop a market rate for whichever day, for whatever location to location, origin destination. And then you can say, well, the carrier will do DAT rate plus 7%, whatever. So there's different mechanisms you can have to make a dynamic matching that's not relying on the routing guide that came from an RFP 18 months ago. So, and it makes sense for those low volume lanes. High volume lanes, it works like a charm. Don't even bother. Contracts work. Everybody wants stability, and that gives stability to both parties, shippers and carriers.
Now, does that also apply to sort of the real time pricing, or do maybe more API integrations? Do those play a role in both of those different strategies?
Yes. So API is just so if you look at the history of connections, that you've got the phone, right, that people connect, and email. But the predominant method that shippers and carriers communicate for this is EDI, electronic data interchange. And it's bulky, it's pain to set up. But once it's set up, it just works like clockwork. It's just works. So for high volume lanes, it makes sense. You set up, you have a pane right up front, but then it just flows once it's set up. For the low volume lanes, the cost of setup isn't worth the amount of volume going through. So you want to do something different. APIs are a good way of providing custom information, and it's system to system. So it really ties to that, and it makes it a lot easier to communicate. You don't have to go through the formal EDI structures. So that works pretty well. What the thing, though, is there is no standard. I mean, the joke with EDI is supposed to standardize everything, and the joke is that it works because everyone has their own standard. There is no standard EDI. Everyone has some kind of the field in the 64th space means something different. So the question is, do you want to find a standard, enforce a standard, or what we're seeing now is more firms are using AI, generative AI, to say, you know what, however you react to me, however you send back to me, whether it's email or something else, my layer will take that and that unstructured data and turn it into structured data. So there's two ways to approach communication. One is agree upon a standard, which is hard, or move the intelligence to receiving and being able to take any kind of input and turn it into something that I can use. So we're seeing a growth of both of those over the last couple of years.
And I imagine that that's a perfect use case for DAT's IQ product, where they can use all of those different benchmarks and apply it to any given situation. Do I have that assumption correct?
Well, we use AI in a bunch of different ways,
Mhm.
and a lot of it is a generation of rates in that. And so we have a bunch of very sophisticated modeling techniques because, I mean, the way that the shippers networks are, most shippers, paper manufacturers, they all have their plants in weird places. Let's be honest. All of their networks are snowflakes, every industry. So the last study I did, this is a couple of years ago, if you stack 30, 40, 50 shippers on top of each other, their networks, less than 5% of the lanes at a 3 to 3 digit level will overlap. Very little. They're snowflakes. Now, those will tend to be the very high volume lanes, right? Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, so those. But then the rest of it, it's very unique.
Hmm.
And so you have shippers that are very different from each other. And so then you have all of these different lanes. And so how do you price those? How do you set a benchmark on those? And that's where the modeling comes in. And we use very sophisticated modeling. Some was developed by Chainalytics over the last 15, 20 years. And DAT's really, our analytics team has done amazing things, and technology's improved dramatically using AI to come up with a better rate for any situation. Even if if that lane has never been used before, Portland, Oregon to Richmond, Virginia, who does that? But we know what the price would be because our model is able to predict that. So that's why you need to have different modeling for that, because you have so many different lanes. That's where it really comes in handy, the
That's
AI.
that's super interesting, because I imagined with all of the different scenario planning, can you actually plan for what we're currently experiencing right now? We are recording this on April 22nd, 2025, just in case folks at 1:45, p.m., just in case, these things change. But with all the geopolitical issues that are going on, how do you find what benchmark works the best?
Yeah, it's funny because one of the biggest users of benchmark transportation rates are people or companies that are doing network design.
Mm.
So I want to put a facility here. I don't have something there now. What drives the decision a lot of times is, it's labor cost, land cost, all that, but it's also transportation. So using these benchmarks, you can actually determine, okay, what would the rough price be for this if I move my facility out to this location? And so that's one of the big use cases of it. And during the pandemic, it was used heavily because companies, like I said before, CPG manufacturers had to open and close manufacturing facilities almost on a weekly basis. So they were doing network flow analysis weekly instead of annually. And so to do that, you've got to understand where your transportation rates are going to be. So we're finding as it gets more volatile, that the need for benchmarks become even more important, because
That's
you're doing things that you haven't normally done. If we're steady state, it's kind of boring. You keep going over, but if something new happens, right? The Francis Scott Key Bridge goes down. that's going to affect rates, right? The West Coast, remember when it had 100 ships waiting off and everything suddenly come to the East Coast, and we realized that we didn't have the infrastructure to take that many containers off the East Coast. So these are things that your benchmarks can really help you with.
And then you've mentioned a couple times about, using different AI, throughout maybe your shipment process, or maybe there are companies that are using AI slash, machine learning. I'm curious if you've seen any other maybe interesting use cases for using maybe like a large language model or something that shippers are using uh, during their, I guess, facing complications and facing different issues that are going on within the
Yeah,
industry.
so there's a lot of debate of what is AI and what is not AI. And if you go to some of the large conferences for software, AI pretty much means they use math sometimes. But if you really look at it, AI is an aspirational term, and historically it's a moving target, and it's usually been the thing that we can't quite do now. So things that 20 years ago, a lot of machine learning was considered AI, neural nets and everything, but it's moved. So I think people have gotten comfortable with the idea, and they say AI slash machine learning, ML. And machine learning is simply a method of whether it's supervised or unsupervised, of gathering insights and recommendations off of data. And there's a whole suite of techniques there. Generative AI is another technique that uses a large language model that does matching and probabilistic nature of determining what makes sense to follow, pattern matching. It really is all about pattern matching. So in my opinion, generative AI, large language models do really well when you have unstructured data. Unstructured data is emails, blog posts, things like that, pulling that down and making sense of it. If you have very structured data, it doesn't add as much value, to be honest. So some of the use cases that I've seen that I think are very strong are one that I described earlier, that enabling you to receive data information from any form, from your carriers, brokers, or other partners, and making sense of it, getting unstructured data and making it into structure so you can act on it, instead of trying to force them to adhere to a standard, which they never will. Another one is if you have to summarize, say you have a marketing channel, and you have a bunch of things that you need to understand, and so you're pulling something from manufacturing reports, something from sales, something from all these different sources. Generative AI is very good at pulling things together and making sense of it and providing a framework for that. So I see that being very useful as well. Where I don't see it being useful, to be honest, is in a TMS, when you want to know, okay, what carriers are not performing well, or what lane has too much capacity. I think questions like that, because the data in a TMS is so structured, the 6 reports you want to ask. Now, beyond that, you might ask some more interesting things, but generally, I think for structured data, you know what you want to ask. Generative AI won't add as much to that. But there are other vendors out there that are doing that. So a chat bot, essentially, I think that's fine. That's helpful, but I don't think it's where the real money changes, the transformational change.
And so it almost sounds like you need to have really those two approaches where you can contextualize the unstructured data, like your emails, your blog posts, but then you have more structured, firm data that plays probably the primary role, if I'm understanding correctly.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And generative AI has so many other applications. Procurement's a big one, especially if you have a lot of products, a lot of SKUs, and a lot of times your product master is not in good shape. And generative AI can be very good at that, to helping determine and better identifying things. So we're finding more and more use cases for it. I'll give you another one that we're doing up here at MIT. There's a classic problem called the vehicle routing problem. And it's just like it sounds, right? You have a bunch of loads for pickup or delivery, and how do you route your driver based on the capacity, the costs, all those different things. And this has been studied since the 17th century with Leibniz, right? It's been out there forever. And so there's a bunch of OR type techniques to try to minimize that, the traveling salesman problem, all those kind of things. Well, one of the challenges that you find is that drivers don't always follow the path, because they know things that the model doesn't. For example, they might be delivering and they know you can't park this time of day, or that street is overly congested at this time. So they will deviate from that. And so we did a project with Amazon trying to understand, well, can I use generative AI, large language models, to come up with more viable, driver-friendly routes, not minimum cost, because what they found is the plan, just like in truckload procurement, didn't match the execution for many good reasons. And so what you can do is you can look at all the good routes that were done, and then you have to train on a lot of data, and you start understanding what makes a good route, what makes a good sequencing. And so you can use generative AI to help you with vehicle routing. So this was really hard for me to understand, but you think about it, we all know generative AI from like our cell phone, when we start typing a message in and it recommends the next word. Well, think of a route as a sentence and every stop as a word. And so all it's doing is saying, okay, here's my recommendation based on the probability of successful ones that you should link together into a chain. So it's very interesting, early days, but it has shown to perform as well as some of these very sophisticated mathematical programming kind of approaches. So there's a ton of areas that we're looking for Gen AI. We're still on the hype cycle, right? But we're getting there, and I think it's going to find its areas where it really adds value.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think you hit the nail on the head when it's, certain tools are great for certain things. It's knowing which ones to use at the right moment that's going to have the maximal impact that you want to see. And speaking of which, for paper manufacturers, we've talked a lot about, all of the different tools that you could and strategies that you could implement. What are sort of I guess the table stakes right now for dealing with all of these unexpected costs and how to maybe potentially save money in the future?
So I think this here's the thing. So you talk about these tariffs and things going on. If you talk to a supply chain professional, they'll say, well, it's just another Tuesday, to be honest. So there's stuff happening, right? And so, but look at what we did the last 5 years, right? We shifted from West Coast to East Coast arrivals for a period of a couple months. Things shut down, and we absorbed. And I think some of those muscles that we trained are still here. Supply chains thrive on being able to handle these things. I'd like to think of them as shock absorbers. So the supply chain is able to be the shock absorber, right, of all these disruptions to keep the business operating smoothly. So if you think about, tariffs come in one country, there's someone in procurement thinking about how do I dual source? How do I move production over? So you're really well equipped, especially in supply chain over the last 5 years, to be really responsive to these changes. So I think the tariffs, do I agree with the policy? That's a discussion for another day. But what a shipper can do about it, and especially paper, and well, they're going to figure that out. This is what they do. This is why they get paid what they do. And trucking, to be honest, is very fungible. You can move things around as opposed to you're not building new rail track, right? You're not building an intermodal yard. So the ability for truckload to be so responsive makes it a little easier. It's not easy, but you can adjust. It's much more flexible a tool. And so I think in some, we're seeing some big churn and all this stuff. And it gets, the press is on it now. The press is suddenly they're experts in supply chain. Now they're experts in global trade. And you're getting all these, the dire straits of stuff. But in the real world, you're dealing with it. You deal with this every day. And this is just one of those situations that's finally rising to the level of public awareness. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on that people aren't aware of. But now this is just, we're hyper aware of it.
And I imagine we kind of started this conversation talking about how, our relatives and things like that know about, the supply chain and know about, just common logistics practices. I'm curious, though, during a phase like this of what we're experiencing where, the media hype cycle is all eyes on supply chain and logistics. Is the seat at the table still there for the chief supply chain officer, the chief procurement officer? Are they still getting that regular seat at the executive table for large scale manufacturers? I imagine they are.
Yeah, it has not changed. It has not changed. In fact, I'm looking back at your background and I see you have Levinson's book, The Box, on your stocks there, and that was one of those obscure books that came out about 15 years ago, and he has a sequel that came out with it that looked at it more, but I think back then it was kind of obscure, but now it's at the table. I think it definitely got its table, a seat at the table rather, during the pandemic, and it stayed there. It hasn't changed because now it's just the opposite. One of the big things that we do at DAT is try to arm transportation executives with the arguments to go to the CFO and CPO and the CEO, the whole C-suite, to understand why things are different. Truckload trucking, transportation is different from most other commodities. And because what happens is in a soft market like we've had for the last 2 to 3 years, if you run a bid, you're going to lower the rates, the new rate differential, which means the contract rates coming in compared to the rates leaving will be lower. So you'll quote, save money. If a CFO sees that 1 year, they'll expect the same thing next year and the next year and the next year. And we have to train people to say, no, it'll come back to bite you, right? It's just the market moving. It's not like you're doing amazing things to the markets in your favor. And the same thing with the idea that if I have a certain amount of volume, if I double it, if I increase, that I'll get a lower rate. And that's false too. There are no economies of scale to purchasing truckload transportation. It's all about economies of scope. And scope just means a balance. Do I have loads going here? Do I have loads coming back? The more unbalanced I have, the higher my rates are going to be. It's just a natural part of the economics of truckload transportation. But being able to explain those things to someone who's not in the space is another thing that we do at DAT. Try to educate so that the C-suite understands the challenges that you're facing.
And so for those procurement workers, chief supply chain officers, all of those different roles that serve, let's just go back to the paper manufacturer example. What are some of those, I guess, insights and tips that you would arm those people so they can go back to their executive team and essentially explain, what is the current market conditions? This is what our costs are expected to be, but it might fluctuate at somewhat, in the near future. What would those little tidbits be?
It's a tough thing. So we'd like to say that, the time to fix your roof is when it's not raining. But it's a temptation. And so we were advising people through the end of 2024 that we expect truckload rates in North America to rise 2 to 4% over the course of the year. And so if you're running a bid, you can easily squeeze it and go to the lowest cost, or you can give some back. Like every time you want to favor incumbents, you're giving some money back. And so we were advising them to do that because we sense that the market is tightening. Now with these tariffs, it's pushing that tightening off. If you look at the rates, they go like this: 2017, 18, 2019, 2020, goes back down in 2022, but then it's been flat. It's not rising. It's not dropping. It's been in what we call a trough for the last 12 to 18 months. So when a system is at equilibrium where it's kind of balanced, any kind of sharp reaction will cause a big jump one way or the other. And what we're trying to figure out is, well, what will cause rates to suddenly increase? It can either be increased demand, dramatic increases in demand, or contraction of capacity. We've seen the carrier base contract over the last 2 years, but there's still 100,000 of those small carriers out there who might have parked their truck, but if the rate comes back, they'll come right back in. So you're trying to understand where do we stand right now? And so what we're advising people: get your roof in order, get your routing guide in order, and be willing to take a 1, 2, 3% price increase. And so now we're seeing that push off a little bit with tariffs, because tariffs will not increase demand. We don't see that happening. Maybe if it works according to what the administration is saying, all this manufacturing suddenly moves back to the US, maybe, but that will be years in the making, and assuming that the policies are stable. And all signs are pointing that they're not stable. They're changing at enacted on Monday, removed on Wednesday. So in this era of uncertainty, it's really hard. And so my recommendation that we always recommend to shippers: work with your core carriers, make sure you have your core capacity in place that you need, and make sure that you have a stable relationship. For the spot or those low volume, low consistency lanes, create a connection with brokers, non-asset based carriers that can provide ramped up capacity when needed, and keep them in tow as well. So just prepare for the surge up when it does happen, because it will happen. It will happen at some point. I don't think it'll be like the pandemic, but it's not going to continue to go down. If you look back 15 years, a compound annual growth rate in rates for dry van truckload is about 2.4%. And so if you continue that out, that's kind of sustainability. If you talk to a carrier, it's tough at a 2 point whatever percent growth because their insurance went way up more than that. Wages went up more than that. Tires are more than that. So we're at that weird equilibrium. I wouldn't expect rates to go down any further, but we're waiting to see if what would cause rates to start increasing beyond the trend of 2.3 to 3%.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks are holding their breath, hoping that we've already reached the bottom, or maybe we're currently at the bottom as far as rates are concerned. But I think it's sort of the commonality phrase of it depends. It depends on a lot of
Yeah,
things.
it depends. That's why this market's, I mean, the industry is so interesting. I've been in this for 30 years now. And it's fascinating because you've got so many players and it's such a big, it's the biggest niche market that we have. It's about $500 billion and it's weird. I used to give a presentation called Truckload, Keep Truckload Weird, because it has different behaviors. It's a drive demand, economies of scope, hundreds of thousands of players. No one sets the price. No one's a price maker or sets the stage. Everyone's a taker. So it has all these interesting components to it. And it's been the playchild of economics professors and OR for decades because it's fun to play with. You can do all these interesting things. It's highly competitive. And it's strangely, deceptively complex. It seems simple, but it's very complex.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to, it's sort of a mic drop moment. But one last question here. Is there anything that you feel is important to mention that we haven't already talked about?
No, I think you've hit most everything. I mean, it's such a big industry, and there's a lot of everyone is a little bit different. Every shipper's a snowflake. Every broker has a different angle. Every carrier has a different area of expertise. But what makes it interesting is really finding the puzzle piece to fit them all together. Where does it make sense to use which different asset, which different type of relationship? And so, like I said, it's been a very interesting industry over the last 20 years, and even more so in the last 5 years as technology has changed. I talked to the president of OIDA, the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association, and he was describing trucking in the 70s. And he said you'd pull into like Chicago, you stop at the local truck station and figure out where the address is and see if anyone there knows where the heck you're going. And you look on a map. Now, carriers, an owner operator has the market in their pocket on a smartphone. I mean, with DAT1, all those other things, load boards, you can see the whole market. So one of the things that's contributing to this more stability, equilibrium I've been talking about is technology. Carriers are much better informed and it's much more frictionless than it has ever been before. So is that leading to less volatility? We'll see. But it's an interesting time to be in this industry. So Blythe, thank you for having me on today.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And you were definitely sharing a lot of those gems throughout this entire conversation. So Chris, where can folks follow you, follow more of your work, all that good stuff?
Just go to DAT. I'm the chief scientist there. So we do a Freightvine podcast every 2 weeks. Just Google Freightvine and I'll pop up, or you can do Caplice at MIT and you can find me there.
Amazing. This was I wrote down a post-it note of all of the great timestamps of really good quotes during this conversation. So it's quite full on my post-it note. So thank you again, Chris.
Great. Glad to be here.